She is right.
And that is legit too. It is her favorite topic.
Yeah, she's very accurate on that. In making this PowerPoint, I got really excited and I was like, ooh, what all can I grab from my storage to show it? So it's like show and tell for me. Which at any point in time, y'all are welcome to come up and look at everything I've got on the table. I'll show you as we go through the presentation what everything is and why it's important to this talk. But like Mary said, this is probably my favorite thing when it comes to growing anything, whether it's on a large scale ag focus or your yard, just taking care of your lawn or your flower beds, whatever you may use it for. So let's dig a little bit deeper on some soil science. Okay, so we're going to go through an introduction, kind of what soil science is. We're going to go over the basics. Then we're going to step into fertility, and then we'll wrap it all up. Okay, so why is it called soil and not dirt? A lot of times I even catch myself calling it dirt simply because it's a lot easier to say for me than it is to say soil. But as my soil science professor would yell at us from across the room while I was at Murray State, we got in a lot of trouble for calling it dirt. And the reason that is because the simplest definition for soil is it is a medium for plant growth. Soil is a collective layering of organic and inorganic materials, aka dirt, that will sustain plant growth. So dirt itself is only one single part of your soil. It's not the whole thing. And at any point in time, if you have any questions or thoughts, just shout it out. So soil is responsible for a lot of different things. And it performs a lot of different vital roles and actions throughout the growing season all year long. So it performs some major vital functions. All life sustains from it. It helps with getting water into the soil where it's then available to your roots. So it acts as a filter system and can filter out the stuff that's not so great for the plants and can use it in a way that is then beneficial to everything else in the environment. It really helps with the ecosystem as a whole, whether it's just for your plants, just for your animals, everything. It's the basis of the ecosystem and it supports life. So where does soil come from? Soil is a mixture of weathered rock fragments or minerals and organic matter that's on the Earth's surface. It's biologically active and a home to countless microorganisms, invertebrates, and plant roots. And it varies in depth from a few inches up to 5 feet or more. Your soil is roughly 50% pore space, and then the other 50% is voids between the soil particles. So this space ends up forming a complex network of pores of varying sizes, kind of like a sponge. And that's really what soil is at the end of the day, is it's just a big sponge that is often dirty. So what this is, like I have on that drawing there, is a soil profile. So it's like a center cut. If you just took a plug out of your yard, a very big one, this is the representation of all of the layers that you would see. So the top layer with your grass, that's going to be your organic matter. Just below that, the skinny dark layer just under it is the topsoil. Then you have your subsurface soil, subsoil, parent material, and bedrock. So each of those layers are classified as a horizon, O, A, E, B, C, and R. And those, for you all, might not mean much, but for myself, when it comes to looking at your soil samples that you send in to Mary and I, that helps us figure out, okay, depending on the depth of your soil sample, that could take into account what your soil results are going to show. Because the farther you get down to your parent material or your bedrock, it's going to show that mineral composition a lot higher than it would on the shallower surface layers. Okay, soil and water. So a productive soil is permeable to water and it has the ability to supply water to your plants. So, like we said, a sponge. And the soil's permeability and water holding capacity depends on two types of pores. So like we 50% pore space. You have micropores and macropores. And obviously, the macros are going to be a lot larger and the micros are going to be a lot smaller. So the larger pores control the soil's permeability and aeration. You want aeration because without oxygen, nothing will live. It will kill off all the organisms and will make all of your soil nutrients lock up to where they can't be used by the plant either. And your plant roots will not support any life to your plant without oxygen either. It's like breathing through a straw. That's how the plant breathes into the dirt in the soil to pull up the nutrients. And if it doesn't have any oxygen in that mix, it's really not going to be good. So your macropores are also produced by earthworms and root channels. So the more that there is a weaving and a web of holes throughout, you're going to have good pore space, you're going to have good permeability, you're going to have plenty of oxygen. But if you cut off that oxygen at any point in time, you're not even going to have those earthworms to do their work either. Micropores. So those are a lot finer than your macropores. And they are responsible for the water holding capacity, which on your soil reports, sometimes you'll see that as WHC, and that is just essentially an equation that soil scientists come up with to calculate essentially how much cubic feet of your soil can hold so much volumetric amounts of water. And it's like, the fine pores in a sponge or a towel. Macropores hold water against the force of gravity, much like the water held in macropores is available to plants. But some is held so tightly that plant roots cannot use it. And that also has a lot to do with the type of soil particle you're working with. We'll get to that in a second, but clay is one of those things that likes to lock up in water and will not let it go. So a lot of times if you are trying to dig, you're like, oh my gosh, we haven't had rain in 3 weeks, but here it is. My yard has so much moisture and water in my dirt. It's likely because it's full of clay. And that brings us to our physical characteristics of soil. So this, for me, is like, I consider this the Bible when it comes to talking about soil, because these characteristics can define everything about what soil you have and what its capabilities are for you. So these characteristics not only can be seen with the eye, but they can also be felt by, checking for texture and things like that. So these main characteristics include color, texture, structure, drainage, depth, and surface features. Color, obviously, is going to be very much a visual thing, something that you're going to see right off the bat. And it's normally determined by your organic matter content, your drainage conditions, and the extent of weather. So this picture is actually a picture that I took at our Princeton Research Farm back last month. And you can see, you might not be able to see it well up there or on your paper, but there's very bright distinctions of colors in that soil profile. And a lot of times that's normally going to be significant and due to what mineral content you have. Going back to the oxygen factor, if there is lack of oxygen, your profile is going to be more gray. So if you can see that line kind of halfway down the middle, a lot of it below it is gray. No oxygen is getting down there. But in the presence of oxygen, above that, it's more of a rusty color. So rust is created through oxidation of metal. It's the same with your soil. So if you have more of an orange colored soil, which up here we kind of have a brownish, muddy color, but then if you move farther east in the state, you start getting the rich orange-red clay dirt. And a lot of times that's because there's so much oxygen present, the oxidation process is allowed with that iron reaction, and you have the rusty color, which is very fertile. And yes, of course, drainage conditions can affect it, and the extent of your weathering. The layer kind of in the middle that separates the two looks like streaks. That is what we call a fragipan. Everywhere in Western Kentucky has it, and well, just about, unfortunately to say. So if you're ever trying to dig in your yard and you get about 36 inches deep and it feels like you're hitting bedrock, you're hitting a fragipan. It's like, it cements itself in the soil and nothing can go through it unless you have a very strong piece of equipment that's not your 2 arms of shovel. So a lot of times when your water permeates through, if it hits that hard pan or fragipan, it's not going to sink through. So if we get a lot like the rains we just had, it is very likely that a lot of that water drained and soaked into the ground, but it only went up to 36 inches deep. It won't go past that because of that fragipan layer. Next is texture. Texture is going to refer to the relative amounts of differently sized soil particles or the thickness or coarseness of the mineral particles in the soil. So your 3 particles are sand, silt, and clay. Here we have a lot of clay. We also have, it's very common for us to have loamy soil, which is a mix of different types of particles in certain percentages. This triangle here, the soil texture triangle, has helped tremendously if you're trying to figure out what kind of soil texture you have, because that's also going to affect if you're going to be spraying any kind of chemical or applying any kind of fertilizer. Your soil texture could affect how well that's actually going to work. If it's sand, pouring water through sand, it'll go straight through because the particles are so large. But with clay, the particles are so fine, they stick together. And when you pour water on it, it just sits on top. And silt, it'll kind of work its way through, it just takes a little bit longer. So it's definitely the halfway mark. With that, you're all welcome to before you leave. But up here in these little containers, I have all 3 different soil particle types, sand, silt, and clay. And you can feel the difference between the particles. And you can see a visual difference, not just with your color characteristics, but with the actual texture characteristics. As well as another, if you like doing cool experiments at home, you can go out to your yard and dig up about 2 cups to about half a mason jar worth of your dirt. Get it in a mason jar, pour water in it, shake it up, let it set on the counter for 24 hours, and it will settle and show you the amounts of each soil particle that you have in your soil. So this one has a high silt content, very little clay, and very little sand. So if you want to come up here later, you can see the color characteristics and where those layers settle out, because ultimately particles are heavier than others when it comes to size. Yes, that's an easy one to do at home. That's just, for me, a random bag of soil that I had laying around that I wanted to use. So that's always a fun experiment to try. And it can be good too to figure out, okay, why do I have water standing in this part of my yard all the time? If you do that, it's most likely going to tell you you're full of clay. Yes. And these triangles can be good too. So you can also determine, so depending on your numbers, you go each side of the triangle and then you meet in the middle, and wherever you meet, that's going to tell you whatever soil texture type you're going to have. Another way to test clay content in your soil is to dig up a little of your yard, get some water, very little, not much, and you can perform a ribbon test. So you can kind of roll it in your hand like Play-Doh, and then spread it between your thumb and forefinger, and however long you can spread or create a ribbon, that can tell you how much clay content you have in that, because if it's a lot of clay, it will stick together and will stay and will not break. But if it's really pretty, it'll definitely have more sand or silt in it. Okay, structure. So the overall composition of the soil, including the organic matter, minerals, pore space, and solid matter, is the structure. So kind of like we talked about earlier, most of it is going to be physical structure, and the other half is going to be pore space. So 45% is going to be your mineral matter or your soil texture types, your particle types. Your 5% for your organic matter, which on average for the state of Kentucky, when you get your soil samples back, if you see on the bottom, it'll say organic matter. It's common for us to have around 2% organic matter, whereas some of our other surrounding states, like Illinois, can have up to 11% organic matter. The more organic matter you have, the healthier soil you will have, because it's full of your organisms and life. And that's truly going to feed your plants the way you want them. Drainage. Soil drainage is defined as the rate and extent of water movement throughout the soil, including across the surface and down into the soil profile. So, and then this graphic just kind of explains as permeability decreases with the soil texture type, the texture type size, the particle size will increase. So, like we talked about, clay is at the top. It's the smallest particle size and least amount of permeability because of that fluctuation. And the same for sand. It has the largest particle size and highest permeability. Soil depth. So the effective depth of the soil for plant growth is the vertical distance into the soil from the surface to a layer that essentially stops downward growth of plant roots. This can be very important because, like we talked about with that fragipan a while ago, if your plant depth is limited by a fragipan, or even in some cases, if you've planted a flower bed and it's, for some reason, you got caught up in what you were doing and you laid plastic in your soil and then planted and then your mulch, and you didn't make a way for your plants to get into and permeate into the ground, you're limiting those roots from being able to get a little bit deeper, because the deeper they can go, the more water they can access, more air they can access, and even more nutrients. Some nutrients, like phosphorus, like to live a little bit lower in the soil profile. So at times, that can make things a little bit difficult, especially since nearly every soil test that I've ever seen that I have worked on being in this position and in my prior career has all been low in phosphorus. That's just common in Western Kentucky. So having it to where you can say, okay, if I can make this more available for my plants, let's do that. Surface features. So structural damage caused by human activity is normally the most severe within the top foot of your soil and can be overcome by proper soil management. So what that's talking about is soil compaction. Soil compaction can be anything from a walking path to driving over it with your lawnmower consistently back and forth. Equipment of any capacity, whether it's a truck or a side-by-side, anything like that. Or constant tillage. If there's constant tillage and then it gets too wet, immediately after, it'll set up like concrete. And that constricts a lot of things in that soil column for the roots to do. So then, it's like creating a fragipan, but a lot shallower. So within that first foot of soil, if your little bitty seedling can't break through, we call it breaking its neck. So as the seedling tries to come out of the seed itself, and there's so much compaction, it will break its neck and will not survive into another plant and continue its life cycle. So by definition, compaction starts to squeeze your macropores into micropores, creating horizontal aggregates that resist root penetration and water movement. And the compaction often occurs during site preparation or house construction, creating a difficult environment for establishing plants. Protect your soil from compaction by avoiding unnecessary foot traffic from machine traffic. And tilling when soil is too wet can also damage soil structure. So when it talks about aggregates, that's going to be your big clumps and clods of soil. So at that point, I know a lot of times you see if there's going to be any road construction or building of houses or buildings or whatever, you see the big clumps of dirt. They look like they could almost be rocks. That's a byproduct of compaction, working that soil when it is way too wet and then leaving it and it sets up to dry like concrete. So then you have a really difficult time for the rest of your plants trying to survive. Another surface feature that's very important and can cause a lot of problems is slope. So the slope aspect or the direction of exposure and soil depth affect availability of water and its use in the soil. Ridge tops and side slopes tend to shed water, while soils at the bottom slopes and in low areas collect it. Not only does water have the tendency to flow in these ways, but so does soil as it erodes over time. So if you know that you have a little more of a slope in your yard or on your property, pay attention to the ways that the slope is angled, whether it's angling down or you're planting something angled up. A lot of times, if you go out and seed your yard this time of year, and then we have a big flood like we just had, unfortunately that will wash all of your seed that you just spread down that slope. And if it was as dry as it had been, it can take quite a bit of that soil surface with it, just because of how dry and powdery everything has been here. When it comes to compaction, this here is a penetrometer, which is a compaction meter. So essentially, you push this into the ground, and you can see at what rate of PSI it has caused compaction issues to your property. And a lot of times, when I practiced with that piece of equipment, we did a simulation there at Murray State dealing with some of the sod there on the property. Well, because of intense construction management and foot traffic, you could not even get the penetrometer into the ground because of how compact the soil had become over time. Soil organisms. Yeah.
Is there any hope for soil once it gets that compacted? What do you do?
Then at that point, what you can do is try to avoid the things that would create it. So try to avoid too much traffic, whether it's by foot traffic or machine traffic over the top of it. Paying close attention to the time of year that you would need to till it. Because tillage can be good as a management practice after that. Once the soil dries out and those clods dry up, then you can come back through and break it up. But if it's too moist, you're just going to set it back up like concrete again. So definitely coming back through and working it in a way that's not going to cause any more harm than already been done. It can be managed, and in some cases can be somewhat reversed. It's just going to take a lot of time. And part of that too can also deal with getting good plants that cause good cover and stay year round, because that can also help with root penetration. So like your grasses, native grasses especially, they can grow root systems up to 6 to 14 foot long. So getting a good root system for your plants can help break those pods up on their own, causing those macropore spaces, breaking that up for you.
So if you tilled it and you did like a 6 footer and you put sand, would that help? If you just try to put a layer of sand on it?
It can, but then you're also changing your soil texture.
Yeah.
So at that point, you then have to consider, okay, if I put all this sand on, what am I going to try to grow next? Because at times, if you try to throw on too much sand, not much will grow in it because nutrients don't hold there, neither does water. It's just going to wash right on through. So then it's just adding more stuff on top for it to grow through, and it's not really going to add much nutrient value or not much value to your pocketbook at the end of the day. Sand can help with leveling your ground more so than it does with compaction. But yeah, at the end of the day, that's just going to fill the holes of what's going to be needing to be opened up for your pores to get that oxygen through.
And it's just mainly that's what's happening in our clay type soil, right?
Mhm.
Not in the good stuff in Iowa or whatever, right?
Yeah, it's pretty much mainly just high clay content soil. Yeah.
So one of the issues too with that is that the pH of clay
Mhm.
is really acidic, and that makes it want to stick to itself.
Right.
And
Between
so
that and the other nutrient particles you have, having the magnetic forces
exactly.
binding everything together. Yeah.
But in my own yard, I found that just lining it and
Yeah.
raising that pH lets the clay breathe a bit more.
Mhm.
And it's soft, like I can feel it when I'm walking on it now. It's especially like after it's dried out a bit, it's not quite
gypsum or something like
Yes,
that in it?
which is lime.
Yep.
Yeah, lime can be there's multiple different types of lime. There's the gypsum lime, and then there's your traditional ag lime, which is calcium carbonate, which helps neutralize the clay particles, because it is so acidic. And a lot of times that's why our pH here is not so great, because we have high clay content. And we'll get into more of the fertility and chemistry parts of that, which, that's a good idea to bring that up already. Thank you. Any other questions before we go on to organisms?
My question was just, what do you amend it with after, when you tell it, and is that lime or?
More so lime than sand, yeah. Because my fear with sand too is, yes, it's the largest particle, but it's also the first thing that's gonna wash. So if you're already having issues, it's just gonna move in another direction versus stay where you want it to and help you the way you want it to.
There is a compound called mycorrhiza. You ever heard of that?
Mhm.
They use it to mix with soil and all that to help hold the balance of nutrients and moisture and all that.
Mhm.
And also helps prevent disease.
Yes. Mycorrhizal bacteria is very good and is one of the ways that a lot of our legume type plants can perform nitrogen fixation, which I'll get into that in a minute too. So thank you for bringing that up.
Now, what's it called? Mycorrhiza?
Mycorrhizal,
How do you spell that?
mycorrhize.
Okay.
You can buy the package at Lowe's Southside for $4.98, and you mix a small amount with a gallon of water, and you mix it with your soil, and it's a protective of your soil. It holds your nutrients. It's a balance. I buy it all the time because I'm a container gardener. I'm not a soil gardener.
yeah, it's essentially binds to the roots and helps with those receptors to be able to attract and make the nutrients more available to your plant for it to take it up. It's just a live bacteria that can be activated by water. And it is very beneficial, and it's all natural. It comes from the earth, so it's been used for many things for a very long time, for sure. Okay, so soil organisms. Soil abounds with life. Besides the plant roots or earthworms, insects, and other creatures you may see, it's home to an abundant and diverse population of microorganisms like your mycorrhizal bacteria. So the more microorganisms that you have, the better off you will be. The important thing is to make the environment favorable for microorganism activity, including well aerated soils, warm, moist, and near neutral pH, giving good levels of organic matter. So your main function of soil organisms is to break down the remains of plants and other organisms. This process releases energy, nutrients, and carbon dioxide and creates soil organic matter. So that's how your upper layer of your soil is created. Up in, like we talked about a while ago, with the large percentage of organic matter up in Illinois, they do have clay, but not in the intense amounts that we do here. So they also have relatively flat ground, where ours is very rolling. We have high spots and a lot of low spots and everything in between. So a lot of their nutrients pretty much stay in the same spot. If they're, aside from being removed from the plant throughout the growing season and then replenished with cover crops and then with maintenance the following year. But having everything, a perfect, comfortable room for your tenants to stay is very important when it comes to microorganisms. And that's just some examples of them on that graphic. I know it's small, but there are a lot of different types of microorganisms. And being micro, you can't normally see them, and you're likely not going to, or consider that they're there. So another good reason to wear gloves in the garden, because you never know what you're going to be taking home on your fingernails. Okay, fertility. So soil chemistry and cation exchange. Your soil colloids, or the clods or PEDs, are extremely small particles that have a net negative charge. This means that it can attract and hold positive charged particles. So your cations, which are positively charged, include potassium, sodium, hydrogen, calcium, and magnesium. And your negatively charged particles include chloride, nitrate, sulfate, and phosphate. And the total number of cations that a soil can hold is called the cation exchange capacity, or CEC, which is also normally listed on your soil test reports. Soil pH. This is kind of the bread and butter that connects everything at the end of the day. Your soil pH measures the acidity or alkalinity of a soil. At a pH of 7, which is neutral, acidity and alkalinity are balanced. Acidity increases by a factor of 10 each 1 unit drop in pH below 7. For example, a pH of 5.5 is 10 times as acidic as pH of 6.5. And your alkalinity increases by a factor of 10 with each unit change above a pH of 7. Your soil pH influences your plant growth in 3 main ways. It affects the availability of plant nutrients, the availability of toxic metals, and the activity of soil microorganisms, which in return affects the nutrient cycling and disease risk. So, I like this soil pH chart because it was colorful. But, as you can see, 7 is green, you're ready to go. Normally, that's where most things prefer to hang out at, is a pH of 7. For most of your row crops, it's between 6.8 and 7. Alfalfa even goes down to 6.2, 6.4. Other crops, blueberries in particular, they like things to be a little more acidic. So they're down in the 5 range, between 5 and 6. Sometimes dipping even a little bit lower, down into 4. And then other crops also prefer a more alkaline or less acidic soil. So yeah, paying attention to what your soil pH says on your soil test can tell you, okay, is this going to be good for my crop? Is that what my crop needs? Am I going to have to put lime on it to bring the soil pH up, or I'm going to have to add some copper to take it down? Stuff to consider later on. Soil nutrients. So the soil itself applies 13 essential plant nutrients, and each nutrient plays a very vital and specific role in plant life. Nitrogen, for example, is a component of chlorophyll, which is normally associated as being green, and it's also in amino acids, proteins, DNA, and many plant hormones. It plays a very vital role in nearly all aspects of plant growth and development, and plants need a lot of nitrogen to grow well. In contrast, plants need a tiny amount of molybdenum, which is involved in the functioning of a few plant enzymes. Molybdenum, nonetheless, is essential, and plant growth is disrupted if it is deficient. Plants also require carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, which they derive from the air and water. Molybdenum, yes, is a metal. So, you don't want it in high concentrations, but when plants do require it in a certain amount. And then this is going to be here broken down into your primary, secondary, and your micronutrients. Most of the time, the ones you hear about the most are your N, P, and K, your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those are your primary nutrients. And then outside of that, very rarely you'll have to add some of your secondary nutrients like sulfur, calcium, and magnesium. As of right now, UK is working on more studies on it, but there's no benefit to adding sulfur for plant growth at this moment. Calcium, as we talked about, is a component in lime, so it helps neutralize pH, which is percent hydrogen. So it helps balance out that hydrogen availability in the soil. And your magnesium also works similarly. And then your micronutrients, or your trace nutrients, can be important more so for other factors and development processes for the plant. So that includes your zinc, iron, copper, manganese, boron, molybdenum, and chlorine. Fertility, nutrients, and pH. So this is a good graphic and one that I would advise you keeping. So when your soil pH is in check, and if you look at the neutral pH of 7, nearly every one of those nutrients bacteria and fungi line up perfectly at a neutral soil. That's where they can live in a more perfect habitat. But you veer off of that in either direction, those nutrients become less available as the pH increases or decreases from a neutral 7.0. And I like having a mental visual of, okay, if I have a soil that's like of a 5, I'm likely not going to have much phosphorus at all. Or if I do, it's locked up and not available for my plants to use, which is very common in the soils that we have because of it being negatively charged and clay being positively charged. So it binds to your clay particles and cannot be released. Soil nutrient deficiencies. So this is when your soil test reports come in. This is normally what you all see after you receive your reports back. And like we talked about, the most common nutrient deficiencies are for your primary nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And they are in largest demand by plants because there are a lot of byproduct pieces of production and growth that those go to. Nearly all soils lack enough available nitrogen for ideal plant growth. Each nutrient deficiency causes characteristic symptoms. In addition, deficient plants grow more slowly, yield less, and are less healthy than plants with adequate nutrient levels. A lot of times for myself, being in the agronomy world, you can normally spot a nutrient deficiency off the bat because the plant is going to show signs. Normally it's a visual color sign, or it's stunted growth, or it has scorch on the end of the leaves. Or if you see that it's in a certain part of the field that's full of water almost all the time, that's also likely saying that because it's without oxygen, it's also in a saline environment with too much sodium. So it's going to stunt plant growth anyway. Your nutrient deficiencies in soils normally warrant the use of fertilizer to help level out the nutrient levels as recommended on the soil test we send back to you. So, like we talked about, so one thing to hint on while you're here, so I imagine most of you, if not all of you, have seen a soil report before or have sent in samples. But when it comes to your soil reports, nitrogen will never have a bar that's colored. That is because nitrogen is one of those nutrients that cannot be measured as readily available in the soil. It's a component of organic matter, so it's not going to be shown and cannot really be tested, other than with a tissue analysis. You can test and see how much nitrogen is available in the plant by sending in a part of the plant, but it cannot be tested in a soil report. So normally what ends up happening, based on research that UK has conducted over however many years they've been doing it, that recommendation for whatever intended plant or crop you're growing will be listed under the recommendations part as a flat, kind of across the board, this is a recommendation for you. And then everything else will be subjective to what your actual results will be. So your phosphorus and your potassium are going to be very important to pay attention to. Because yes, we talked about nitrogen and how important it is, but your phosphorus and potassium, very important. Your phosphorus, I like to think of it as a prenatal vitamin. That is the booster and supporter for all reproductive functions of your plant. So if at any point in time you expect it to flower, put on fruit and even seeds, you're going to need something to help boost that process along and give it some strength throughout the growth process. Because a lot of times what plants go through is when they get into the energy, I'm growing, I'm getting big, I'm getting tall, and then they get into the reproductive stage, they're putting all their energy into what they're producing and not taking care of themselves. So then at that point, they're going to be a lot more susceptible to disease, to any kind of stress that could come their way. If they're going to be even more susceptible to serious damage from insects, which cannot be fun at times. So paying attention to what life cycle your plants are in at the same time can also save you a lot of money and a lot of stress at the end of the day. Your potassium is very good at your water holding ability and drought factors with your plants. It acts as an added electrolyte for the plants hold on to a little bit more water longer and use those nutrients it has available. Nutrient availability. So, plants can take up only nutrients that are in solution, like we talked about with phosphorus, and they're only available as dissolved in water. Most soil nutrients are not in solution, but instead are tied up in soil mineral and organic matter in insoluble forms, like we talked about. These nutrients become available to plants only after they are converted to a soluble form and dissolved in soil solution. The rate of nutrient release from your soil organic matter is somewhat faster and depends on the amount of biological activity in the soil. So, if you have a more hospitable environment with everything you have, then you're all good. Yes, so when it's warm, moist soil, and nearly non-existent in cool, dry soils. And the seasonal pattern of nutrient release is similar to the pattern of nutrient plant uptake, which is also very important when you take your soil samples on a yearly basis. You don't have to take them every year, but it's recommended that you take them at the same time of year, so either in the spring or in the fall. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I was looking at my report when you were talking about the
Yeah.
reports, and I have no idea what cation, exchange capacity, and cation saturation means.
Okay, I can go back to that. So your cation exchange capacity is the total number of cations a soil can hold, ultimately, which normally when it comes to, where did you take your soil sample? What kind of capacity are you using it for? Are you using it for a vegetable garden, flower
Yeah.
garden, yard?
Vegetable garden.
Vegetable garden. So a lot of times, if it's not on a commercial scale, the cation exchange capacity or the CEC, those numbers at the bottom of your report are null and void. To the soil chemistry people at the lab, that means something. But when it comes to making an application and doing things at the end of the day, there's not really anything you can change at that point. So your only recommendation is just to apply whatever fertilizer it says on this bar. Let me pull that. There it is. So yeah, so like it says, the typical CEC for Kentucky is 11 to 19. What did yours show by chance?
44.
Ooh, okay. What did your calcium and magnesium, were they high?
Yes.
Yeah, so that's just saying that, so your cations are your calcium, magnesium, potassium, anything that is positively charged in the soil, also with your pH. So what is your pH?
7.2.
So it's gonna be a little more higher than neutral, which is not bad, depending on what you're wanting to grow, of course. But, that's just essentially telling you, okay, you have a lot of positively charged nutrients and minerals in your soil. So there's nothing wrong with that. That's good.
Okay.
Yeah, that just means you have really, really good soil compared to
My
others
plants
that
don't like it.
your plants don't like it.
Not very much.
Does it hold a lot of water?
I have to water every few days.
Okay. When it rains, does it usually puddle up and stay that way for a little while?
Not really.
Well, that's good at least. Do you till it?
It's an in-breeze.
Okay, and that could be why too. Did you put, a bag mix?
No.
Okay.
It was a mix between the soil we got from the front yard and the compost we got from the city.
Okay, and that could be it too, having the compost in it. That will also raise those levels and have them very high, which isn't a bad thing either. And we can talk about that more when we get done here in a minute too, because I would like to definitely see your reports. Any other questions? Okay. Sorry. You're good. And like we talked about, your clay particles and soil organic matter have negative charges on the surfaces and can attract cations, and they hold the nutrient cations in reserve for rapid release in soil solution to replace nutrients taken up by plant roots. And its reserve supply of nutrients completes in and contributes to a soil's fertility as a whole. So the soil capacity to hold cations is, like we talked about, the cation exchange capacity. The nitrogen cycle. So this where we talk about the mycorrhiza as well. So when I'm talking about a legume, most common that a lot of people think about on a normal scale would be clover. Clover is a type of legume, so it has the ability to fix its own nitrogen within the soil. So this is kind of a very backwards way of looking at this graph, but this is what was in your chapter. So as it goes through, in section A, the legumes, soil, organic matter, crop residues, and organic additions are sources of organic nitrogen. Organic nitrogen is then mineralized into ammonium by soil microbes. Commercial fertilizer supplies nitrogen as an ammonium or nitrate, which is negatively charged. Microbes nitrify ammonium and into nitrite and then into nitrate, and then plants, microorganisms leaching below the root zone and release the gaseous nitrogen to the atmosphere, remove nitrogen from the root zone soil solution, and then crop harvest removes nitrogen stored in plants, and then nitrogen is also present in both crop residues and soil microorganisms, becoming part of the soil organic nitrogen content. So, no, it's a lot. What that's saying is your legume, your clover, your soybeans is another one, alfalfa is another one. Those legumes take those legumes take the organic nitrogen out of the soil, completes these chemical reactions, and changes it into a way that it can be used. It also takes nitrogen out of the atmosphere, works it in, and uses it in a way that's beneficial and not causing destruction in the air. Yeah.
I buy about 20 cubic feet of
Mhm.
non-organic soil.
Mm-hmm.
I put it in raised beds in January.
Okay.
Can I get the nitrogen out of the climate and hydrogen and treat my soil for 3 months and have enough nitrogen to plant new plants?
You would need to plant something that would actively take in that atmospheric nitrogen. So you could plant clover, you could plant,
Well, I raise gardenias, and that's the reason why I buy non-organic, because you
Mhm.
cannot raise gardenias on organic soil,
right.
because the pH level is way up here and
Mhm.
all that.
Yeah, the only way to harness that atmospheric nitrogen is having a legume or nitrogen fixing plant that has the capacity to take it up and use it. Because that's when your mycorrhizal fungi comes in, because the roots of those plants have nodules, and it's the reaction with the fungi that is able to work with that nitrogen to make it in a way that's usable for the plant. Okay, now we're gonna get to fertilizers. So understanding fertilizers. Fertilizers supplement a soil's native nutrient supply, and they're essential to good plant growth when the nutrient supply is inadequate. Rapidly growing plants, such as annual vegetable crops, generally need more nutrients than slowly growing plants, such as established perennials. You can use processed fertilizers, organic fertilizers, or a combination of the two to supply soil nutrients. So with your processed fertilizers, that's going to be the ones that are manufactured or refined from natural ingredients to make them more concentrated and available to more plants. Typically, they are processed into soluble ionic forms that are immediately available, whereas your organic fertilizers are natural materials that have undergone little or no processing, including both biological materials and mineral materials. So that would be more like your compost. Fertilizer labels. The labels on your fertilizer package tell the amount of each of the 3 primary nutrients in the fertilizer, expressed as a percent of total fertilizer weight. So it will also be always listed in the order N, P, and K. So therefore, like with this bag, a lot of times it's called triple 15, so that also means it's 15 pounds of nitrogen, 15 pounds of phosphorus, 15 pounds of potassium. And like with this conversion on the PowerPoint, it says, thus, a bag of fertilizer labeled 5-10-10 contains 5% nitrogen, 10% phosphorus, expressed as P2O5, and then 10% potassium as K2O. And this information is your fertilizer analysis. And that, to the left of the fertilizer bag, is the conversion. You won't necessarily have to know that, because there are these great things called a fertilizer calculator. I use them daily, and it makes my life so much easier. That is what is used to calculate exactly how much fertilizer is recommended based on what your soil report nutrient says. So if yours says you need to add 200 pounds of nitrogen, that's not going to be 200 pounds of urea. That's just 200 pounds of nitrogen. So the calculator that I use that UK provides, and I can show you all what that is as well. The calculator, you plug in your main types of fertilizer that you're looking at using to get your nutrient analysis. Put your numbers in, it calculates it and tabulates exactly how much of each fertilizer you need, and will tell you how close in surplus or deficiency you are from still meeting that mark of whatever poundage you may need. Organic fertilizers, your compost and manure. So the labels on fertilizer package, like we talked about, tell the amount of each of the primary nutrients. Compost, being the biggest key to composting, is to supply a balance of air, water, energy materials with a low carbon to nitrogen ratio, such as grass clippings, green garden trimmings, or fresh manure, and bulking agents like materials with a high carbon to nitrogen ratio, such as corn stalks, straw, and woody materials. You don't need additives to stimulate your compost pile, you just need to provide conditions favorable for natural composting organisms. You can compost in some of the following ways. You can do a hot compost, which is normally fast, or a cold compost, which is a lot slower. So the hot compost produces high quality finished compost in 6 to 8 weeks. And to maintain a hot compost pile, you must mix together balanced volumes of energy materials with your bulking agents, keeping the pile moist and turning it frequently to keep it aerated. And then a slow compost requires less work than a hot, and build the pile and leave it until it decomposes on its own. This is normally attracted to edible waste in compost piles. And then you can also compost your fruit and vegetable scraps and worm bin. This method works really well for urban gardeners who have little space, and you can bury fruit and vegetable scraps and allow them to decompose in your garden there in the soil. And then your manure depends per animal always, just simply because of the digestive systems that they have and their diets. So animal manures vary widely in nutrient content and nutrient availability depending on the type of animal producing the manure and the manure's age for handling. So for example, fresh manure has higher nutrient contents than aged manure, which can also mean it's hotter. And then manure diluted with large amounts of bedding has fewer nutrients than diluted or undiluted manure. And then exposure to rain leaches these nutrients, which is a little more common sense on that part. And then composting under cover retains more nutrients but reduces nutrient availability. So at that point, you are at risk of kind of cooking those nutrients out because it is so hot in that one congested space, especially if you're not moving it in any capacity. Soil sampling. So when taking your sample, it's very important to follow these steps. Collect your samples from at least 10 different spots in your garden and avoid any unusual areas such as an old dump site, burn pile, rabbit hutch. If you know you have a bad spot where your grass is dead or a spot of the garden that holds too much water, don't immediately go to that spot because it's going to skew the rest of your data for your entire garden. So that spot may then be specific in need of one specific thing. And if that's true, you can come back and sample that spot differently later on to figure out how to treat it kind of spot treatment style versus doing a catch-all It's very important to sample the top 6 inches of soil if the soil has been tilled and 0 to 4 inches for untilled soil and lawns. Not only is it important to sample at a specific depth, but sampling the same depth every single time. So, say I took my big probe, because this is the one I prefer, especially if I'm walking 7 acres at a time. And because I'm me, and this reminds me of a pogo stick, I immediately step up here and jump as hard as I can. Well, say right here I do it, it goes all the way down and I have a sample that long. Well, I go to the other side of the field I'm on, I only get that much. That's very inaccurate, because then we talked about earlier, the deeper you go down in your soil profile, the different chemicals you're gonna pull up. So even in 2-inch increment changes, you can drastically change how much fertilizer your soil reports are gonna tell you to add, simply because of inaccuracy. So the more accurate you are when sampling, it's very important. So in that scenario, if I had known that I was likely going to be needing my 4 to 6 inches, I would have only taken that top portion and just let the rest go back down, and I will not use it. And then I'll try to stay consistent where I go from there. Don't pull, if you do have a long core that you pull, don't collect this down here, collect what's at the top, because you're gonna wanna be consistent to even your shorter sample at the end. And then air drying your samples and mixing them together well, which that can happen here at the office when you bring your sample in. And then send about a pint of the mixed sample to the lab via the extension office. So most of you have already sent in samples, but you can come in. Both of these 2 types of probes are available to you here at the extension office if you want to be accurate, because I find it much easier to sample with a probe than I do to go throughout my yard with a shovel and try to get 10 different scoops from across. And then you'll put it in your little bag, just like this. To bring it here, you don't have to have the bag. You can bring it in a Ziploc bag, you can bring it in a bucket. Just keep it all together for that one spot. It's very important to not go in a straight line. So if I'm sampling, I'm not going to go in a straight line every 2 foot. You want to zigzag kind of across, so then you rule out any favoritism or bias with your samples, because if you have that, then you also run the risk of not being accurate. And then, now we're going to wrap things up a little bit. So like we talked about, soil is more than just dirt. There are multiple different physical soil characteristics. There are a lot of living and chemical reactions that continually occur beneath the soil surface. There are multiple different fertilizer options available. Make sure to be consistent with soil sampling. And lastly, don't hesitate to call if you have any questions. So now, I'll open it up for more questions, if there are any. And you're, like I said, you're more than welcome to come and look at this stuff too. I've got some other things here on the table. This is a garden tutor soil pH strip. So if you're curious and you don't really want to send in a whole sample, like the spot treatment we talked about, if you have one corner of your garden that's like, I don't know about it, you can get you a little bit of your sample, mix it with water, take one of these test strips, stitch it in the water, and depending on what the color of the strip changes to, that will tell you your pH. You can test a fertile part, and you can see the varying differences if it's a pH issue, and then we can look at, okay, if it's a pH issue, it could also be affecting the rest of those nutrients that we looked at earlier. So, like we talked about, at the end of the day, pH controls a lot of what goes on in your soil.
You found those to be accurate as compared to what you're gonna do? Just like-
Relatively accurate, yeah. I would like to think so. And they're normally within close enough of a range to, if you see that it's, yes, I may have something different, then I would definitely recommend in that spot pulling some samples and bringing it in. And it doesn't have to be a whole pint, it can also be a little more than a pint, but also doesn't need to be just a spoonful of dirt in your bag, because at the end of the day, there's not a whole lot they can do with that sample. There have been times where I've heard going into the lab that, they're like, yeah, we've had to send samples back simply because they didn't fill the bag up enough. Or the residing agent or whoever may be, collecting the samples at the office may be like, okay, you're gonna have to go back and collect more. And if that happens, it's not saying you did anything wrong, it's just we want more from you to try to get everything as accurate as possible. What were you
You
gonna say?
realize there's a great failure in the nursery industry